Take off those medals." The judge's voice cracked like a rifle shot through the silent courtroom. Every eye turned to her. The small woman in dress blues nobody believed had earned the right to wear them. They called it stolen valor. They said her service record didn't exist. They had no idea what they were about to unleash. Rowan Calloway didn't flinch, didn't argue. She simply looked past the judge, straight into the eyes of a retired admiral sitting frozen in the third row, a man who had buried a secret for 15 years. Then she spoke 3 words, just 3. The admiral's face turned the color of old paper. His chair scraped back, his knees nearly buckled. Because those 3 words weren't just a phrase. They were a door one that had stayed locked since the day her father was declared dead in a training accident that was never the truth. What she uncovers next will shatter everything. The lights in the courtroom were too bright. Rowan noticed that before she noticed anything else. Too bright and too white and humming faintly. A frequency she could feel behind her back teeth. The kind of hum that meant fluorescent tubes nobody had replaced in a decade. She stood at the defense table with her hands folded. Still, like she'd been taught. Like her body remembered how to be still, even when everything underneath the stillness was screaming. Judge Admiral Thorne leaned forward on the bench, 60-something. Silver hair combed back hard. A face that had spent 30 years believing paperwork over people. Miss Calloway. His voice cracked through the room like a dropped rifle bolt. "Take off those medals. Silence. The kind that has weight. The kind you could lean on." Because nobody moved. Because the bailiff by the door shifted his stance, uncertain, and the court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys, frozen mid-word. "Your Honor," Rowan's attorney started, half rising. "Sit down, counselor." Thorne didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed locked on Rowan. On the ribbons pinned crooked across her chest, the medals that existed nowhere in any database he had access to. The decorations that officially on paper, in every system a judge could query, did not exist. This court does not honor stolen valor. Take them off. Now, Rowan's pulse didn't spike. That was the strange part. 15 years of training had scraped that reflex out of her a long time ago. What she felt instead was quieter, colder, a kind of falling into place, like a bolt sliding home. She looked past the judge, past the flag hanging limp against the wall, past the gallery full of strangers who'd come to watch a small-town scandal unfold, who had no idea they were about to watch something else entirely. She found the man in the third row, navy blue suit that didn't fit him the way it used to. Admiral Marcus Whitfield, retired, though nobody in this room knew that yet except her. She held his eyes, and she said 3 words, "Widow 6 Actual." The room didn't understand. The room couldn't understand. To everyone else in that courtroom, those 3 words were nonsense, a code with no lock, 3 syllables that meant nothing. But Whitfield's face went the color of old paper. He stood up, chair scraping. Too loud in a room that had gone dead silent. Bailiff started, confused now, the authority in his voice cracking at the edges, because something had just happened that he did not control and did not understand. Whitfield didn't sit back down. He stood there, one hand braced on the bench in front of him, like his knees had gone soft, staring at a woman he had not seen in 3 years and had spent every one of those years hoping he would never have to face again. "Your Honor," he said, and his voice came out wrong, thinner than the voice that had once given orders that moved battalions. "I need this court to hear something before you say another word about that woman's medals." Rowan didn't move. She let it happen. Let the room tilt on its axis around those 3 words she'd been carrying like a loaded weapon for 6 weeks, waiting for the exact moment to fire them. 6 weeks. That was where this had started. Not here. Not under these lights. It had started in the mountains, in the cold, in a life she'd built specifically so nothing like this could ever happen again. 6 weeks earlier. The Bitterroot Range didn't care what you used to be. That was what Rowan liked about it. Mountains had no memory, no file, no security clearance to strip away. Just granite and pine, and the particular silence that came after snowfall. A silence so complete it felt like the world holding its breath. She lived at the edge of a town called Larkspur Hollow, population 600 and shrinking. in a cabin she'd rebuilt with her own hands over 2 winters. Rebuilt because the bones of it were good and the roof wasn't, because she needed something to fix that wasn't a person and wasn't a mission and wasn't a version of herself she used to be. Mornings started before the sun. They always had. Some habits didn't unlearn themselves just because the war did. She was in the yard at 5:40, breath fogging, rifle sling worn smooth from years of use, resting against her shoulder like it belonged there. Because it did. Because some things fit a body the way nothing else ever would again. 400 yards out, a steel plate hung from a dead pine, rust orange and dented from years of impact. She didn't need the distance, didn't need the practice. She did it anyway, because stillness required maintenance. Because a body that had once made the impossible look easy did not get to forget how, even in retirement, even in hiding, even here. Breathe in, half out, hold. The shot cracked across the valley and came back twice, an echo folding into an echo, and 400 yards away the plate rang like a church bell nobody had asked to hear. She lowered the rifle, checked her watch. 6:02, time to open the shop. The shop was a converted barn on the edge of town. Callaway Gunsmithing, painted on a sign she'd made herself. Uneven letters that she'd never bothered to fix because fixing them felt like admitting she cared what the town thought. Which she didn't. Except she did, a little. The way you always do about a place that never quite lets you all the way in. Larkspur Hollow had opinions about her. She knew that. Heard it in the way conversations stopped a half-second too late when she walked into the diner. Heard it in the way old men at the hardware store measured her with their eyes like she was a puzzle missing pieces. 29 years old. No husband. No family visiting. No explanation for how a woman that size 5'3", maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, could group 5 rounds inside 2 inches at 300 yards without her hands shaking. Nobody asked her directly. Small towns didn't work that way. They circled. They speculated in the spaces between words. Military, probably. Something bad happened, probably. Best not to pry, probably. They were right about the first part. Half right about the second. Dead wrong about the third. Because prying was exactly what was about to happen to her, whether she wanted it or not. The bell over the shop door rang at 9:15. Rowan didn't look up from the trigger assembly she was cleaning. "We're open," she said. "I can see that." She knew the voice before she looked up. Knew it the way you know weather changing in your joints before the sky admits anything. Doc Reyes stood in the doorway, and he looked older than the last time she'd seen him, which had been almost 2 years ago, at a funeral neither of them had wanted to attend, for a man neither of them had been able to save. "You drove 6 hours," Rowan said. It wasn't a question. 8, actually. Wyoming's bigger than it looks on a map. He shut the door behind him. Quiet, the bell barely tapping. "You gonna offer me coffee or just stare at me like I'm a repo man?" "Coffee's bad. I've had worse." "I was a combat medic, Ro. I've had coffee made in a helmet." Something in her chest loosened. Just slightly, the way it always did around him. Doc had a gift for that. For making rooms feel less like rooms and more like something survivable. She poured him a cup anyway, handed it over without a word. He wrapped both hands around it like it was cold outside, though it wasn't. Not really. Not for October. "You didn't drive 8 hours for coffee," Rowan said. "No. So say it." Doc looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that came from a man who'd held pressure on wounds while telling patients they were fine, who'd learned exactly how to deliver bad news in a voice that didn't shake even when his hands did. "They're taking your father's name off the wall," he said. The trigger assembly in her hands went still. "What wall?" "The memorial." "Larkspurs and Row. It's not just here. Fort Larkin's Veterans Association voted last week. Grayson Ridge is voting next month. It's spreading. Somebody's feeding paperwork to every VFW post within 300 miles that ever had Holt Callaway's name on a plaque." "What paperwork?" Doc set the coffee down, didn't drink it. His jaw worked once before he spoke, like the words cost him something to say out loud. "Desertion," he said. "That's what the file says. Dishonorable. They're saying your father walked off a post in '91 during Desert Storm rotation and never came back. and that everything after the commendations, the classified work, all of it was fabricated to cover for a man who ran. The words landed in the shop, like something dropped from a height. Rowan set the trigger assembly on the workbench. Very carefully, the way you set down something that might otherwise end up thrown across a room. That's not true, she said. Flat. No heat in it yet. The heat would come later. Right now there was only the cold, clean fact of it, sitting in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. I know that. You know that because you were there. You pulled him out of Kestrel Ridge with a collapsed lung and carried him 2 clicks on your own back. Doc, you know exactly what kind of man deserts a position. I know. Doc's voice cracked, just slightly, just once. Doesn't matter what I know. Matters what's in a file somewhere with a stamp on it, and somebody with a lot of money went and got that file changed. Rowan turned away from him, looked out the shop window at the gray mountain light, at the pines standing in rows like men at attention, at a world that had felt, 20 minutes ago, like something she'd finally made safe. I'm not doing this, she said. I mean it. I built a life up here specifically so I wouldn't have to do this, whatever this is, whatever's coming. I'm not walking back into it. They're erasing him. He's already gone. The words came out harder than she meant them to, sharper. 15 years of grief compressed into 4 syllables. 15 years gone, Doc. Let him rest. Let me rest. Doc studied her for a long moment, and something in his face wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was disappointment wearing a patient expression, the kind that didn't argue because it didn't need to. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, Rowan. He set a folder on the workbench. Didn't push it toward her. Just set it down and let it sit there, an object in the room she would have to choose to look at or not. That's the filing, he said. The one that started it. If you change your mind. He left without finishing his coffee. The bell rang once, small and tinny, and then the shop was quiet except for the wind working at the eaves, and Rowan stood there with her back to the folder for a long time before she finally turned around. She didn't open it. Not that night. She told herself she wasn't going to open it. Told herself the same thing for 3 days, moving through her routine like a woman, walking a familiar trail, blindfolded the range at dawn, the shop at 9, dinner alone at the small kitchen table that had only ever been set for one, except the folder sat on the workbench the whole time. Because she hadn't thrown it out. Because some part of her had already decided something, the rest of her wasn't ready to admit yet. On the 4th night she opened it. Photocopied pages. A DD 214 that wasn't her father's. The dates were wrong. The unit designation was wrong. The discharge code sat in a box that should have read honorable, and instead read something else entirely. A sworn statement from a man Rowan had never heard of, claiming to have served alongside Holt Calloway in a unit that, as far as she knew, her father had never been assigned to. It was good work. That was the sickening part. Whoever built this file understood exactly how bureaucracy worked, understood which boxes needed which numbers to make a lie look load-bearing. Underneath the fabricated discharge paperwork was a letterhead, a logo she didn't recognize, a stylized shield wrapped in a ring. The words Ironclad Meridian Defense Systems printed beneath it in cold corporate serif. She didn't know the name. Would learn to hate it soon enough. At the bottom of the folder, almost an afterthought, was a newspaper clipping. Larkspur Hollow Gazette, dated 3 weeks ago. A photograph of the town's Veterans Memorial Wall, 40-some names carved into gray stone. A wall she had walked past 1,000 times without stopping. Because stopping meant looking at one name in particular, and looking at that name meant remembering things she'd spent 15 years trying not to remember. Holt J. Calloway. 3rd row. Middle of the alphabet. Middle of everything. The article was short. A notice that the town council would be voting on recent developments regarding certain names on the memorial at the next public session. Rowan read it twice. Then she closed the folder and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, hands flat on the table, breathing the way she'd been taught to breathe, before a shot slow in, half out. Hold, except there was no shot to take here, no clean line to a clean target. Just a 15-year-old grief with a corporate logo stapled to the front of it. She thought about her father the way she always did when she let herself think about him at all in fragments. Because full memories hurt too much to hold whole. Because it was easier to remember pieces. His hands guiding hers on a rifle stock when she was 9 years old. Patient in a way he almost never was about anything else. His voice, low, always low, like he'd trained himself never to raise it even when he had every reason to. The sound of a door closing at 3 in the morning, over and over across her childhood. A man leaving for somewhere he was never allowed to name. Coming home changed in ways he was never allowed to explain. And then no door at all. Just a knock instead. 2 men in uniform standing on a porch in July, and a folded flag, and a story about a training accident that never quite lined up right. That she'd been too young and too shattered at 17 to question out loud. Though some part of her had questioned it every day since. She'd built her whole adult life around one fact she'd never let herself examine too closely. Her father had died in service, honorably. And that honor was the one thing nobody could take from her, even though they'd taken everything else. Now, somebody wanted to take that too. Rowan sat in the dark and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not since her last deployment. Not since the last time she'd had to be the version of herself that this was about to require again. Anger. Clean and cold and entirely without mercy. She picked up her phone at 11:40 that night and called a number she hadn't dialed in longer than she wanted to admit. Doc picked up on the second ring, like he'd been waiting. "I'm in," Rowan said. A pause on the other end. Not surprise. Relief maybe. Held carefully so it wouldn't sound like relief. "Figured," Doc said. "What do you need?" "Everything you've got on Ironclad Meridian. And I need to see the council session schedule." "When's the vote?" 9 days. "That's not enough time. It's what we've got." Rowan closed her eyes. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the pines. That same mountain silence she'd built her whole life around, and for the first time in 3 years it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the held breath before a shot. "Then 9 days is enough," she said. "Get Preacher, and find out who's actually behind this filing. Somebody paid for this, Doc. Somebody with money and a reason, and I want to know both before I walk into that room. You're not going to go in quiet, are you?" Rowan looked at the folder still open on the table, at her father's fabricated shame typed up in cold corporate serif. "No," she said, "I'm not." Preacher Dalton lived 2 hours south, in a trailer at the edge of a national forest, in a silence he'd built for himself the same way Rowan had built hers, except his silence had teeth in it that hers didn't. He answered the door before Doc even knocked, which was either good instincts or bad sleep, and with Preacher it was usually both. "Heard you were coming," he said, voice like gravel dragged over gravel. "Heard why?" "Word travels fast," Doc said. "Word travels exactly as fast as I let it." Preacher stepped back to let them in. The trailer was cleaner than Rowan expected. Spare in the particular way of a man who owned nothing he didn't need and needed less than most people thought was possible. "Rowan, know you're recruiting for her." "She called me first." Something shifted in Preacher's face. Not quite surprise. More like the recalibration of a man who'd assumed one outcome and was quietly pleased to be wrong. "Then I'm in," he said. "Before you even ask." "Wasn't gonna ask. Wasn't sure I needed to." "You didn't." Preacher sat down heavy in a chair that had clearly held his weight in exactly that spot 1,000 times before. Man like Holt Calloway gets his name stripped off a wall for something everybody who served with him knows is a lie. That's not a maybe I'll help situation. That's a hell yes situation. Doc allowed himself something close to a smile. "First one in days." "There's a kid too," Preacher said. "You remember Vance Okafor? Fast roped into the wrong LZ twice and still made rank early. That Vance Okafor? That's the one. Discharged 8 months back. Living in Bozeman, doing odd security work, bored out of his skull and looking for something that matters." Preacher's mouth twisted, half a grin, half a warning. "Fair notice. He's got opinions about how the old guard does things. Thinks we're slow. Thinks half our instincts are outdated. Is he wrong? About some of it? No." Preacher shrugged, unbothered. "World moved on some while we were busy not talking about the parts of it we survived. Kid's not wrong to push back. Just gonna take some getting used to." Doc nodded slowly, filing that away. Rowan's gonna need every angle. Legal pressure's coming from somewhere with real money behind it. Corporate name on the paperwork, Ironclad Meridian Defense Systems. You know it? Preacher's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. The particular stillness of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. I know the name, he said slowly. Contractor. Equipment supplier, mostly. Comms gear, ballistic vests, some vehicle armor plating. Government contracts going back 20-some years. He paused. There was a recall. Long time back. Faulty batch of something. I never got the full story. It got buried fast. You're telling me that company's the one coming after Holt's name? Looks that way. Preacher was quiet for a moment, staring at nothing in particular. The kind of quiet that meant a man was assembling pieces he didn't yet have all of. Then this isn't about a filing error, he said finally. This is somebody protecting something. You don't spend real money erasing a dead man's memorial plaque unless the dead man knew something that's still dangerous today. Doc felt the weight of that settle into the room. I'll tell Rowan, he said. Tell her something else too. Preacher stood, moved to a locked cabinet at the back of the trailer, the kind of cabinet that didn't hold dishes. Tell her I've been waiting 3 years for reasons to be useful again. Tell her I'm grateful it's finally here, even if I hate what it took to get her there. The council session was scheduled for a Thursday night in the Larkspur Hollow Community Hall, a squat brick building that smelled permanently of coffee and floor wax, folding chairs, arranged in crooked rows for an audience that rarely numbered more than 30 on a good night. That Thursday, every chair was full. Word had spread the way it always did in small towns, not through any official channel, but through the diner, the hardware store, the church parking lot after Sunday service. A war hero's name might come off the memorial wall. That kind of news moved faster than weather. Rowan sat in the third row, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, wearing a plain gray coat over civilian clothes, because she hadn't decided yet, hadn't let herself decide yet whether tonight required more than that. Doc sat on her left, Preacher on her right, arms crossed, eyes doing slow sweeps of the room the way they always did, cataloging exits and threats out of habit rather than necessity. 2 rows back, a younger man Rowan didn't recognize sat alone, posture too straight for a civilian, watching the room with the specific attentiveness of someone who'd been trained to watch rooms. Vance Okafor, she assumed. She'd meet him properly after. If there was an after, that made sense to meet in. At the front of the hall, behind a folding table draped in a faded American flag cloth, sat the 5 members of the Larkspur Hollow Veterans Memorial Council. Rowan recognized 3 of them. Old men who'd known her father, or claimed to, who'd shaken her hand at his memorial service 15 years ago and told her what a fine soldier he'd been. Tonight, none of them would meet her eyes. The chairman, a heavy-set man named Council Chair Dunmore, cleared his throat and tapped the microphone twice. "We'll come to order," he said. "Tonight's session concerns Agenda Item 4, the status of certain names currently displayed on the Larkspur Hollow Veterans Memorial Wall, in light of documentation submitted to this council regarding discrepancies in service record." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Rowan kept her eyes forward. "We have with us tonight a representative from the organization that submitted the documentation in question," Dunmore continued, and gestured toward a man Rowan hadn't noticed until that moment, seated near the front, apart from the council table, dressed in a suit too expensive for a community hall in a town of 600 people. He stood, smooth, practiced, a man who'd given this kind of presentation 100 times before, in rooms far more important than this one. "Thank you, Chairman Dunmore." His voice carried without effort, trained for it. "My name is Preston Ashworth. I represent the Veterans Records Integrity Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring the accuracy of military honors and memorial recognitions nationwide." Nonprofit. Rowan felt Preacher shift beside her, a small motion, barely visible, the kind of tell that meant he'd caught the same lie she had. "Our organization received, through a confidential source, documentation suggesting significant discrepancies in the officially recognized service record of Holt J. Calloway. Ashworth continued. I want to stress that we take no pleasure in bringing this matter forward. Our sole interest is ensuring that the honors on this wall are honors truly earned. He clicked a small remote. A projector screen behind him lit up with the same fabricated discharge paperwork Rowan had already read 4 times in the dark of her kitchen. This document, Ashworth said, obtained through legitimate research channels, indicates that Mr. Calloway's service concluded under circumstances substantially different from what has been publicly represented for the past 15 years. Rowan's hands, folded in her lap, went very still, because it wasn't the lie itself that made her blood run cold. She'd already braced for the lie. What made her chest tighten was the ease of it, the polish. The rehearsed compassion in Ashworth's voice calibrated precisely to sound like reluctant duty rather than what it actually was, which meant this wasn't the first time he'd done this, which meant somewhere else. In some other small town, some other family had already sat through this exact performance and lost. Ashworth clicked through 2 more slides, the sworn statement from the man Rowan had never heard of, a photocopy of a signature that was supposed to be her father's, and wasn't quite right. The letter formation subtly wrong, in a way only someone who'd spent a childhood watching that exact signature sign school permission slips would ever notice. We understand this is difficult news for the family, Ashworth said, and for 1/2 second his eyes found Rowan's across the room deliberate. She realized, not accidental, a small performance of sympathy aimed directly at her, and we want to be clear that our organization's only goal is accuracy, not cruelty. Rowan stood up. The room went quiet, the way rooms do when something unplanned happens in the middle of something carefully planned. May I speak? She said. Not a question, though she'd shaped it like one out of habit, out of the small courtesies her father had drilled into her, before he'd taught her anything else. Dunmore looked flustered, glanced at Ashworth, who gave the smallest possible nod. Magnanimous, generous, a man graciously allowing a grieving daughter her moment. Go ahead, Miss Calloway. Rowan stepped into the aisle, didn't approach the front, didn't need to. Her voice, when she used it, had a way of carrying without volume, trained into her by years of needing to communicate across distance without ever raising a sound. That signature is wrong, she said. The Y in Calloway loops the wrong direction. My father signed his name the same way every single time for 41 years, because a man taught him penmanship in a 1-room schoolhouse in 1963, and it never changed. Whoever forged that signature didn't do their homework. A ripple through the crowd. Dunmore's eyes widened slightly. That's a serious allegation, Miss Calloway, Ashworth said, smooth as ever, unbothered. Forgery is a strong word. It's the correct word. Rowan held his gaze. And I'd like to know who paid the Veterans Records Integrity Project to bring this specific document to this specific town at this specific time. Because nonprofits with confidential sources usually have a funding disclosure. Do you have one? Something flickered behind Ashworth's composed expression. Small. Fast. Gone almost before it registered. But Rowan had spent years learning to read exactly that kind of flicker across a scope, across a distance, in the half-second before a target moved. Our funding sources are a matter of public record, Ashworth said, available upon formal request through the appropriate channels. Then I'll be requesting them, Rowan said, formally. Tomorrow morning. Dunmore, visibly relieved to have something procedural to hold on to, cleared his throat. The council will table tonight's vote, pending further review of the submitted documentation's authenticity. 2 weeks. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks. Not a victory. Rowan knew that even as murmurs of relief moved through the crowd around her, even as an old woman 2 rows back reached out and squeezed her hand on the way past. 2 weeks wasn't a victory. 2 weeks was a stay of execution, nothing more. And stays of execution ran out. But it was time, and time, right now, was the only currency that mattered. Ashworth caught her in the parking lot. She heard his footsteps before she saw him measured, unhurried. A man who'd never once in his life had to walk fast to catch anyone. Miss Calloway. He stopped a respectful distance away, hands in his coat pockets, breath fogging in the cold night air. That was well done in there. Genuinely. Most people don't catch details like the signature. You clearly know your father's handwriting. I know a lot of things about my father, Rowan said. None of which are up for debate. Everything's up for debate when there's documentation. Manufactured documentation isn't evidence. It's a story somebody's paying to have believed. Ashworth's expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes did, a small recalculation, the look of a man revising his assessment of an opponent upward. You should know, he said, that this process, once it starts, tends to move regardless of individual resistance. I'd encourage you to think carefully about how much of yourself you want to spend fighting something that, historically, doesn't stop. Is that a threat, Mr. Ashworth? It's professional advice. He smiled, the kind of smile that had probably closed 100 negotiations, that had probably never once meant anything close to warmth. From someone who's seen how this ends for families who dig in. How many families? I'm sorry? How many families have you sat across from and given this exact speech to? Before tonight, I want a number. The smile thinned, just slightly at the edges. I don't keep count, Miss Calloway. I do, Rowan said. As of tonight, I'm one, and I don't lose. She turned and walked to her truck without waiting for a response. And behind her, in the dark of the parking lot, Preston Ashworth stood very still for a long moment before he took out his phone. She didn't see the second man that night. Nobody did. He hadn't come to the community hall at all. Had, in fact, made a point of staying away from any room that might connect his face to this matter in the memory of 30 small-town witnesses. Colonel Grant Sheffield sat instead in a rented office 40 miles away, in a strip mall storefront with blacked-out windows and a lease signed under a shell company name, watching a live audio feed of the meeting through an earpiece, jaw tight, hands folded on a desk that held nothing but a single manila folder and an old service photograph he hadn't looked at directly in 15 years. In the photograph, 3 men stood in desert fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, squinting against a sun that had long since stopped rising on any of their old lives. Sheffield, younger, unlined. Beside him, a man with Rowan's same gray eyes and a grin that hadn't yet learned what it would cost him to keep his people safe. Holt Calloway. When the audio feed cut to Rowan's voice, that signature is wrong, the Y loops the wrong direction. Sheffield closed his eyes. She's sharper than her file suggested, said the voice on the other end of his phone. Ashworth, calling in from the parking lot, low and clipped. This isn't going to move as fast as projected. It doesn't need to move fast, Sheffield said. It needs to move quietly. She's requesting funding disclosures tomorrow morning. Give her a version that satisfies the request without satisfying the question. Sheffield opened his eyes, looked at the photograph again, at the grin, at the arm around his shoulder, at a friendship he had once believed would outlast everything, including this and Ashworth. Don't underestimate her again. I made that mistake with her father once. It's not a mistake this family makes twice. He ended the call before Ashworth could respond. Sat alone in the dark office for a long time, the earpiece still warm against his skin, the photograph still open on the desk in front of him, and somewhere underneath 15 years of careful silence, something that might have once been called guilt stirred and did not go back to sleep. Rowan didn't sleep that night either. She sat at her kitchen table with the folder open again, and this time she didn't stop at the discharge paperwork. This time she kept reading, past the fabricated documents, into the newspaper clipping, into a section she'd skimmed too fast the first time to fully absorb. A quote from the article. Council Chair Dunmore, 3 weeks ago, before he'd looked her in the eyes and looked away. The council takes these matters seriously and will act in accordance with whatever the evidence supports. Evidence, as if evidence were a fixed thing, as if it hadn't been built, brick by careful brick, by someone with enough money to make a lie load-bearing. She thought about Ashworth's face in the parking lot, the recalculation behind his eyes, the way he'd said history doesn't stop for families who dig in, like he was quoting a policy from a manual somewhere, a manual written by someone who had done this before, more than once, enough times to have a manual at all. Somebody was funding a machine built specifically to erase names. and her father's name was only the one she happened to know. She picked up her phone. Doc answered on the first ring this time. "Couldn't sleep either?" he said. "I need everything on Ironclad Meridian," Rowan said. "Not just the equipment recall you mentioned. I need to know who ran it, who approved contracts, who might have had a reason to make sure a dead soldier's name never got investigated too closely. You think this goes higher than a lawsuit over a memorial wall?" "I think somebody's spending real money to keep something buried," Rowan said. "And I think whatever they're protecting is bigger than my father's reputation. I think his reputation is just the part of the grave they're worried somebody might dig up first." Silence on the line. Then Doc's voice, quieter, more careful. "Vance found something today, before the meeting. He didn't want to say it in front of everybody. Say it now. There's a name that shows up in 3 different filings related to the original equipment. Recall the one Preacher remembered, buried in a footnote. An approving signature on a report that got sealed a long time ago." Doc paused, and Rowan heard him take a breath. The particular breath of a man about to hand someone a weight he wished he didn't have to. "It's Sheffield, Row. Colonel Grant Sheffield's name is on that report." Rowan sat very still. Grant Sheffield. The man who'd taught her father to shoot before he'd ever put on a uniform, who'd stood at the front of her father's memorial service and spoken about honor with tears actually visible in his eyes, who'd sent her a card every year on the anniversary of Holt's death for the first 8 years, until the cards had simply stopped coming, and she'd assumed, without ever asking why, that grief eventually just ran its course for everyone. "That's not possible," she said, though even as she said it, some cold certainty was already settling into her chest. The particular certainty that comes not from knowing something, but from finally admitting you'd suspected it all along. "I know what you're about to say," Doc said gently. "I said the same thing when Vance showed me. But the signature's there, Rowan, and the timeline lines up with your father's death almost exactly." Rowan closed her eyes. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the pines, and the mountains held their silence the way they always did, indifferent to the particular grief unfolding inside one small cabin at their feet. 9 days, she said finally, more to herself than to Doc. "We had 9 days before the vote. Now we've got 2 weeks and a name we weren't looking for. What do you want to do?" Rowan opened her eyes. Looked at the folder on the table, at the forged signature with the wrong loop, at the corporate letterhead, at the newspaper clipping with her father's name printed cold and small in a font that would decide, in 2 weeks, whether history remembered him as a hero or a lie. "We find out exactly what Grant Sheffield signed off on 15 years ago," she said, "and we find out exactly what he's been protecting ever since. Because I don't think my father died in an accident, Doc. I think somebody made a decision that killed him. And I think the same somebody is still making decisions right now to make sure nobody ever finds that out. That's a hell of an accusation to build a case on." "I'm not building a case," Rowan said. "I'm building a shot. There's a difference." She stood, moved to the window, looked out at the dark line of mountains against a darker sky. "A case takes years and hopes 12 strangers agree with you. A shot takes one clean line to the truth, and the patience to wait for it. And if the truth's worse than we think?" Rowan thought of her father's hands guiding hers on a rifle stock, thought of a door closing at 3 in the morning, over and over, a man leaving for somewhere he couldn't name, thought of a folded flag in a story that had never quite lined up right. "Then it's still the truth," she said, "and he's still owed it. 15 years late is still on time, Doc, as long as it finally arrives." She hung up the phone and stood alone in the dark kitchen for a long time. And outside the window, far off toward the ridgeline, a single light burned in a cabin that wasn't hers. Preacher's old truck parked at the trailhead, engine running. A man who couldn't sleep either, keeping watch over a road that led back toward town, toward a fight none of them had asked for, and none of them, now, would walk away from. 2 weeks. Rowan Calloway had spent 3 years building a life specifically designed to never require this version of herself again. She put the folder back together, squared the edges, and set it beside her rifle case by the door, where she would see it first thing in the morning. Then, for the first time in 3 years, She opened the small metal box she kept on the highest shelf of her closet, the one she never opened, the one that held a single photograph, a set of dog tags that weren't her own, an emission patch stitched with a wolf spider crouched inside a widow's black hourglass, the unofficial insignia of a unit that, as far as any official record was concerned, had never existed at all. Widow 6. She held the patch in her palm for a long moment. Then she set it on the table beside the folder, beside her father's stolen name, and sat down to begin the long work of taking it all back. 2 weeks. A vote that would either preserve or erase 15 years of grief built around a single unquestioned fact. A corporate name she'd never heard before tonight, attached to money that clearly ran deep enough to fabricate paperwork and fund traveling operatives with rehearsed sympathy in their voices. A man she'd trusted her entire childhood, whose signature now sat buried in a report connected to whatever had actually killed her father 15 years ago. And somewhere beneath all of it, waiting, patient as stone, 3 words she didn't know, yet she would eventually stand up in a courtroom and say out loud, 3 words that would turn an admiral's face the color of old paper, and finally, after 15 years, crack open a silence that had buried far more than one man's name. Rowan turned off the kitchen light, picked up the rifle case by the door, and for the first time in 3 years checked the lock on every window in the house before she finally let herself sleep. Tomorrow, the fight started for real. The archive room in Rowan's memory smelled like cold metal and ozone. That was the detail that always came back first. Not the mission, not the target. The smell of a server room 3 stories underground, recycled air scrubbed too many times, and the particular hum of machines that never slept. She was 26 years old the night of the Ridge shot. Except that wasn't the name anyone used at the time. At the time, it didn't have a name. It was just a number on a mission board and a distance nobody believed was survivable, let alone makeable. 1,140 meters. Crosswind gusting unpredictable off a canyon wall. Target moving between 2 structures with a 6-second window, maybe 7 if the wind held. It didn't hold. Rowan lay flat on cold rock for 4 hours before the shot. 4 hours of stillness so complete her own heartbeat became the loudest thing in the world, a metronome she had to work around, instead of through. Because a heartbeat moves a rifle. Because even a whisper of pulse translates down a barrel into inches of error at that distance. So she'd learned, the way her father had taught her, to find the gap between beats. The half-second of true stillness, where the whole universe seemed to pause and wait with her. She took the shot in that gap. The radio afterward didn't say her name. Couldn't say her name, because Widow 6 didn't exist on paper, which meant the shot that ended that particular mission had to belong to somebody who did exist on paper, which meant it went to a lieutenant 3 states away who'd never fired that weapon, never lain on that rock, never found that gap between heartbeats. Rowan hadn't argued. That was the part that still sat wrong in her chest all these years later. She hadn't argued because arguing wasn't part of the job. Because glory was never the currency Widow 6 operated in. Because the whole point of being a ghost was that ghosts didn't need credit to be real. She told herself that for years. Told herself it enough times that most days she almost believed it. Except now, sitting at her kitchen table with her father's forged discharge papers spread out in front of her, she understood something she hadn't let herself understand before. The world that stole her credit for the Ridge shot was the same world that had erased her father's honor. Not a coincidence. A pattern. A machine that used people up and then, when it was convenient, rewrote what they'd given. She wasn't going to let it rewrite Holt Calloway. Not while she still had breath to stop it. Vance Okafor arrived at the cabin 3 days after the council meeting, driving a truck that had seen better decades, carrying a laptop bag and an expression that suggested he'd already decided this whole operation was being run by people who'd forgotten how modern problems got solved. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, by way of introduction, standing on Rowan's porch with the particular bluntness of someone who hadn't yet learned which things were safe to say out loud. "You're ruder than I expected," Rowan said back, and something in Vance's face flickered surprise. Maybe, or the beginning of respect. Hard to tell which yet. Come in. Coffee's bad. Doc will tell you the same. Preacher already told me. Said, and I quote, worst coffee this side of a faux latrine. Preacher exaggerates. Preacher's not wrong, though. Doc called from the kitchen, and Rowan threw a dish towel in his direction without looking. And for one small unguarded second, the cabin felt almost like something other than a war room, almost like a family gathering for people who'd built their families out of scar tissue instead of blood. Vance set his laptop on the table. Didn't waste time on more small talk. I pulled everything public on Ironclad Meridian, he said, which isn't much, which is itself interesting because a defense contractor that size should have more digital footprint than this. Somebody's been scrubbing. Scrubbing what? News coverage, mostly. There's a recall from 16 years back. Preacher already flagged it comms equipment, some kind of encryption module failure. I found 3 news articles that reference it. All 3 got quietly updated within the last 2 years. Softened language. One had an entire paragraph removed. Rowan leaned over his shoulder, studying the screen. You can prove that. Wayback Machine snapshots. Cached versions. It's all there if you know where to dig. Vance clicked through, pulling up side-by-side comparisons, and Rowan watched 15 years of careful erosion play out across 2 columns of text. Somebody's been managing this story for a long time, not panicking, managing. That takes patience and it takes money. Or it takes somebody inside the system who never stopped watching. Preacher said from the doorway, arms crossed, and everyone turned toward him because his voice had gone flat in the specific way that meant he was circling toward something he didn't want to say. Sheffield, Rowan said. Sheffield, Preacher agreed. Vance looked between them, confused. Who's Sheffield? A man who taught my father how to hold a rifle before either of them ever wore a uniform, Rowan said quietly. A man who spoke at my father's funeral. A man whose signature is apparently on a report connected to whatever this recall actually was. Vance sat back slowly. That's not a small thing. No, Rowan's. It's not. They found the recall report 2 nights later. Not through any official channel, those were sealed tight, buried under enough classification stamps that even Vance's considerable digital patience couldn't crack them from a kitchen table in Montana. They found it because Doc remembered something, a name. A woman who'd worked logistics on the same base, retired now, living quiet, outside Fort Larkin, who might, if approached carefully, remember things that had never made it into any official record. Her name was Corinne Ashby, 61 years old, silver-haired, sharp as a blade despite 30 years of institutional silence trained into her bones. She met them at a diner off the highway, chose the booth in the back, and didn't say anything at all until the waitress had come and gone twice. Holt Calloway's daughter, she said finally, studying Rowan's face like she was checking it against a memory. You've got his eyes. Same gray. I remember thinking that at his funeral, though you probably don't remember me being there. I don't, Rowan admitted. I don't remember much of that day at all. No, I don't imagine you would. Corinne wrapped both hands around a coffee mug she hadn't touched. What do you want to know? Everything about the equipment recall, Doc said. 16 years back. Comms gear. Encryption module failure. Corinne's face changed, went carefully blank. The particular blankness of someone drawing on decades of practice at giving nothing away. That's a long time to be asking about ancient history. It's not ancient to us, Rowan said. My father's name is coming off a memorial wall in 2 weeks because of paperwork somebody manufactured to bury this exact history. I need to know what actually happened. Corinne looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Rowan started to think she'd hit a wall she couldn't get past. And then something in the older woman's posture shifted, some internal calculation finally landing on an answer. It wasn't an encryption failure, she said. Voice dropped low, barely above the hum of the diner around them. That was the cover story. What actually happened was a batch of comms relays Ironclad Meridian sold under contract had a fault in the power regulation circuit. Field conditions heat, mostly, sustained heat above spec, and the units would overheat and fail, completely dark. No warning, no degraded signal to alert anybody something was wrong. Just silence, right when a unit needed to talk to command most. Rowan felt something cold settle into her stomach. How many units failed? Officially, 4 in testing after the fact. Unofficially, Corinne's jaw tightened. Unofficially, I processed requisition forms for replacement units for the better part of 8 months, all through the same supply chain, all flagged priority critical. You don't replace 4 units priority critical. You replace 4 units when you're quietly trying to swap out a much bigger number before anybody notices the pattern. And nobody caught it. Somebody caught it. Corinne's eyes flicked toward Preacher, then back to Rowan, deliberate. A field report came through about a unit going dark during an active operation. Team lost commo at a critical window. No backup contact possible. The report that came after described a full mission failure with, she paused, and her voice thinned, with one confirmed KIA. The diner around them kept moving. Waitresses refilling coffee. A bell over the door somewhere, a family laughing 2 booths over, and Rowan sat perfectly still in the middle of all of it, feeling the floor of her entire understanding of her father's death crack straight down the center. "That's not what happened to my father," she said, though even as she said it, the words came out unsteady, uncertain of themselves. "He died in a training accident." Corinne's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went gentle in a way that was somehow worse than if she'd simply said the words directly. "That's the story that went in the official file," she said carefully. "I processed the paperwork myself, Miss Calloway. I know exactly what story went in that file. I also know I filed a requisition for a replacement comms relay unit, priority critical, dated 4 days before your father's death was officially reported to this command." The silence at the table stretched long enough to hurt. "Are you telling me," Rowan said, very quietly, very carefully, because if she let any heat into her voice right now, she wasn't sure she'd be able to pull it back, "that my father died because a piece of equipment failed? Equipment that Ironclad Meridian knew was faulty, and somebody wrote a different story instead of that one." "I'm telling you what the paperwork suggests," Corinne said. "I never had proof strong enough to say more than that out loud. Not then. Not for 15 years. Her hands tightened around the coffee mug. "I've carried this a long time, Miss Calloway. I'm glad somebody's finally asking." They drove back to the cabin in silence. 2 hours of Montana highway, unrolling gray and empty, under a sky heavy with coming snow. And nobody said much of anything, because there wasn't much to say that wouldn't sound small against what they'd just learned. Rowan sat in the passenger seat and watched the mile markers pass, and thought about a door closing at 3 in the morning. Thought about a man who'd never been allowed to explain where he was going or what he was risking. Thought about 17 years old, and a folded flag, and a story about a training accident that had never, not once in 15 years, felt completely true. Now she knew why. Because a company had sold faulty equipment to men who trusted their lives to it. Because somewhere along the chain of accountability, somebody had decided that fixing the problem was less important than hiding it. Because her father had died in the dark, literally in the dark, cut off from the people who could have helped him, and the only story anyone had ever offered her about it was a lie built to protect a corporation's bottom line. "You're quiet," Doc said, eyes on the road. "I'm doing math," Rowan said. 15 years of grief, and I built it all around the wrong shape." "The grief's not wrong, just the reason underneath it. That's supposed to help?" "No," Doc admitted. "It's supposed to be true. Sometimes that's all I've got." Rowan looked out the window at the dark tree line rushing past. Somewhere out there, 40 miles from a rented office with blacked-out windows, a man named Grant Sheffield was still keeping his silence, still protecting whatever he'd been protecting for 15 years, still letting a lie stand in the place where the truth about her father should have been. "I want to know what he signed," she said. "I want to see the actual document with his signature on it, not Corinne's memory of it. Not a rumor. I want the physical report." "Where would that even be?" "Sealed archive," Vance said from the back seat, already pulling his laptop open, the glow of the screen lighting his face in the dark of the truck cab. "Records like that don't get destroyed." too much institutional liability in destroying evidence, even buried evidence. They get sealed and stored. Physical facility, probably. Somewhere with restricted access but not total isolation, because somebody still has to maintain the archive. You can find it? I can find the facility. Vance's fingers moved fast over the keyboard, and Rowan watched something shift in his posture. The restless boredom she'd sensed in him at the cabin door, replaced by something sharper, more focused. A young man finally handed a problem worth his full attention. Getting inside it is a different question. That's what we're for, Preacher said quietly from where he sat beside Vance, and something in his voice carried the weight of a man who'd broken into places far more dangerous than a records facility. A long time ago, for reasons that had felt just as urgent then as this felt now. The facility sat 40 minutes outside Fort Larkin, an unremarkable building on unremarkable land. Gray concrete under gray sky. The kind of place designed specifically to be forgotten by anyone who didn't have a reason to remember it. Chain link fence, a single guard post. Cameras mounted at intervals that suggested competent but not extraordinary security. They planned for 4 days. Rowan ran the operation the way she'd run 100 operations before. Not because the stakes here were military, but because the discipline was the only thing standing between them and disaster. Every entry point mapped. Every camera angle timed and logged. Every possible failure mode discussed and planned around. Because failure modes were the only thing that actually mattered in the moment they happened. Vance chafed against the pace of it. "We could be in and out in 90 minutes if we moved now," he said on the second night of planning, tapping impatient fingers against the kitchen table. "Every day we wait is a day closer to that council vote. Every day we wait is a day Sheffield has to figure out we're looking at him. And every corner we cut is a day somebody gets hurt because we rushed," Preacher said, not looking up from the facility schematic he was studying. "I've seen what rushing costs, kid. I don't need to see it again. With respect, old man, I've also seen what waiting costs." The room went quiet. Doc glanced at Rowan, a silent question. "How do you want to handle this?" And Rowan set down the pen she'd been using to mark entry routes and looked directly at Vance. "Preacher's not wrong," she said. "But neither are you. We move fast. We don't move rushed. There's a difference, and the difference is the only thing that keeps people alive in this kind of work." She held his eyes until she saw something in him settle, some restless energy finding a frame to sit inside instead of straining against it. "You want to prove the new way works? Prove it by being precise, not by being fast. Precision is what actually saves time, because precision doesn't need to be redone." Vance was quiet for a moment. Then, grudgingly, something like respect crossed his face. "Copy that," he said. They went in on a Tuesday night, under a sky heavy with the season's first real snow, visibility down to almost nothing beyond 50 yards, which was either terrible luck or the best possible cover, depending entirely on how you looked at it. Rowan chose to look at it as cover. The plan was simple in the way that good plans always were. Vance handled the exterior cameras, the guard post, a controlled disruption to the facility's network timed to create exactly 90 seconds of blind coverage. Not a second more, because 90 seconds of outage read as a glitch, and 5 minutes read as an attack. Preacher handled the physical entry, a side door with a lock that hadn't been updated in longer than the facility probably realized. Doc stayed with the vehicle, engine running, medical kit ready, because that was always Doc's post, the quiet, unglamorous job of being ready for the worst, so nobody else had to carry that fear into the work. Rowan went in alone for the archive itself. The building's interior was exactly as forgettable as its exterior. Fluorescent lights, most of them off for the night shift, a single security guard doing rounds on a schedule. Vance had clocked down to the minute. Rowan moved through the dark corridors the way she'd been trained to move through far more dangerous spaces. Silent, deliberate, every step placed before her weight, ever fully committed to it. The archive room sat 3 levels down. Cold metal and ozone, exactly as she remembered from a different building, a different life. The smell apparently universal to any place designed to store the truth in the dark. She found the sealed report in under 4 minutes. Vance's research had been precise: a filing code, a shelf location, a drawer number, and her hands, when she pulled the folder free, were steadier than she expected them to be, given what she already suspected was inside. She didn't open it there, didn't have time to. She photographed the seal, confirmed the classification stamp matched what they were looking for, and slid the folder into a flat case strapped against her back, and turned to leave exactly 90 seconds before Vance's network disruption was scheduled to end. She made it 84 seconds before something went wrong. The guard came around a corner she hadn't accounted for, off his logged schedule by nearly 6 minutes, which meant either Vance's research had a gap in it or the man had simply deviated from routine tonight, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything Rowan had planned around. He saw her. For one long frozen half-second, neither of them moved. Then his hand went to the radio at his shoulder, and Rowan's whole body shifted into something automatic, something trained so deep into her that thought barely entered into it at all. She closed the distance before he got a word out. Not violence. She didn't need violence, didn't want it. Not against a man who was almost certainly just doing an honest job he had no idea was protecting a 15-year-old lie. A controlled strike to the wrist, the radio clattering away across the floor, a firm hand at his shoulder guiding him down into a chair with more care than the moment probably called for. "I'm sorry," she said, low, quick, already binding his hands with a zip tie from her kit. "This isn't about you. I need you to believe that." The guard, wide-eyed, said nothing. She was 3 minutes over the extraction window by the time she made it back to the side door. And outside, the snow had thickened into something close to whiteout, and she could hear, faint over the wind, the sound of the network disruption clearly no longer holding, alarms somewhere deep in the building, beginning to stir awake. Preacher was waiting at the door, waiting and visibly relieved, and already moving before she'd fully cleared the threshold. "We've got company," he said. Second guard, off schedule, must have been doing a walkthrough somewhere Vance's intel didn't flag. He clocked the alarm trigger. "He's coming around the east side. Then we go west. West's got the fence line. No clean exit. West's got cover," Rowan said. "That's what matters right now." They ran. The snow worked for them, and against them in equal measure visibility down to almost nothing, which meant the second guard couldn't easily track them. But it also meant Rowan couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. Running blind across unfamiliar ground toward a fence line she was navigating mostly from memory, and Vance's voice crackling low in her earpiece. 200 yards to the vehicle," Vance said. "Doc's got the engine running." "Go, go, go!" The gunshot cracked through the storm before Rowan even registered the guard had drawn a weapon. She didn't know, in the chaos of the moment, whether it was a warning shot or an aimed one. Didn't have time to know. What she knew with total clarity in the half-second after the sound cracked across the dark field was that Preacher, running just ahead and slightly to her left, staggered. "Preacher, I'm good." His voice came out wrong, tight. Wrong in a way that told her immediately he wasn't good at all. "Keep moving. I'm right behind you." He wasn't right behind her. She turned, half a step, enough to see him go down hard against the snow, one hand pressed white-knuckled against his side, dark spreading fast against pale fabric even in the low light. "Doc!" Rowan's voice tore out of her, all training briefly overridden by something rawer, older, the particular fear of watching someone you loved go down in the field. "Doc, we need you now." The truck's headlights cut through the storm a moment later, Doc already out of the driver's seat and moving before the vehicle had fully stopped. Medical kit already open in his hands, years of trained calm settling over his face, even as his hands moved fast enough to betray how much he was not calm at all underneath it. "Talk to me," Doc said, kneeling beside Preacher in the snow, hands already working, pressure applied before words had even finished leaving his mouth. "Feels like a graze," Preacher managed, teeth gritted. "Feels worse than a graze. Because it's not a graze." Doc's voice stayed level, professional, but Rowan caught the flicker underneath it, the same fear she was feeling reflected back at her. "Entry wound, upper abdomen, left side. Ro, I need you driving now." Vance, get the door. They loaded Preacher into the truck with the particular desperate efficiency of people who had all, at some point in their lives, done exactly this before, in far worse conditions. And Rowan slid into the driver's seat with hands that were, for the first time in longer than she could remember, visibly shaking. "Nearest hospital's 40 minutes, she said, voice tight. "He doesn't have 40 minutes if this goes wrong fast," Doc said from the back, hands still pressed hard against Preacher's side, voice climbing with an urgency he was fighting to keep controlled. "Drive, Rowan. Drive like the mountain's on fire." She drove. The snow made the road nearly invisible, the world reduced to headlights and white, and the sound of Preacher's breathing going ragged in the back seat. And Rowan gripped the wheel and pushed the truck faster than any sane person would push a vehicle through a whiteout. Because sanity wasn't the calculation that mattered right now. What mattered was a man in the back seat who'd driven 8 hours without being asked, who'd said hell yes before anyone had finished explaining what they needed, who was bleeding out in the dark because of a decision Rowan had made about how fast to move. "Talk to me, Doc," she said, eyes locked forward on the barely visible road. "He's stable. For now." Bleeding slowed. Stopped. A pause, the sound of Doc adjusting pressure, his voice tight with concentration. "He needs surgery, real surgery, real fast. I can keep him alive in this truck. I can't fix this in this truck. Then we get him there. We get him there," Doc agreed. And something in his voice, some old unspoken understanding between two people who'd been in exactly this kind of moment together before, in a different truck, in a different country, years and years ago, settled the fear in Rowan's chest just enough to let her keep her hands steady on the wheel. 38 minutes later, they pulled into the emergency bay of a hospital in Fort Larkin, and Rowan watched Preacher get wheeled away through double doors that swallowed him into a world of fluorescent light and hurried voices. And for one long moment afterward, standing alone in a parking lot with blood on her hands that wasn't hers, she let herself feel every bit of the fear she'd been holding back on the drive. Then she wiped her hands clean and went back inside, because the fight wasn't over, and Preacher, more than anyone, would have hated to see her stop. He survived surgery. Doc told her that at 4 in the morning, standing in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee, exhaustion carved deep into both their faces. "He's stable," Doc said. "Bullet missed everything that would have killed him fast, nicked his liver on the way through, which is not nothing, but it's survivable. He's got a rough few weeks ahead. He'll live." Rowan closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, let herself lean back against the hospital wall and simply breathe. "This is on me," she said quietly. "It's not. I set the timeline. I made the call to go Tuesday instead of waiting another week to reroute around that second guard schedule. You made the call with the information you had," Doc said, firm, the same steady voice he'd used 100 times before to talk soldiers back from the edge of blaming themselves for things war had actually decided. "This is what the work costs sometimes, Rowan. You know that better than anyone. Blaming yourself for the cost doesn't change the math. It just adds more weight to carry." Rowan didn't answer. Didn't have an answer that felt honest enough to say out loud. Down the hallway, Vance sat in a plastic chair with his head in his hands, laptop closed beside him, looking younger than Rowan had seen him look since he'd first shown up rude and restless on her porch 6 days ago. She sat down beside him. "This what you wanted?" she asked quietly. "Fast." Vance didn't look up right away. When he did, his eyes were red-rimmed, and whatever bravado had carried him through the last week had burned itself out somewhere in that hospital parking lot. "No," he said. "This isn't what I wanted at all." "Then say what you're actually feeling." "Because I need my team honest right now, not performing certainty they don't have." Vance was quiet for a long moment. "I've been telling myself the old ways were slow because they were scared," he said finally. "I think I had that backwards. I think the old ways are slow because slow is what keeps people breathing." He looked toward the doors. Preacher had disappeared behind hours earlier. "I'm sorry for pushing." "You didn't put that bullet in him," Rowan said. "A guard off his schedule did that." And whoever's paying to keep a 15-year-old lie buried did that, further up the chain than either of us can currently see. She put a hand briefly on his shoulder, the gesture unfamiliar to her but necessary. In the moment, the kind of comfort her father had never quite learned to offer, and that she was only now, slowly, learning to offer herself. We finished this. Not fast, not slow. Precise, for him. Vance nodded, and something in his posture settled, the restless energy finally finding solid ground to stand on. The report, when Rowan finally opened it 2 days later, at Preacher's bedside, in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and quiet relief, was worse than Corinne Ashby's careful, cautious account had suggested. Because it wasn't just a signature. It was pages. Detailed test data showing the comms relay failure rate under field heat conditions, dated 8 months before her father's death. A cost-benefit analysis, cold and clinical, weighing the price of a full recall against the statistical likelihood of field failure during active operations. A recommendation, signed and dated, to proceed with limited quiet replacement rather than public recall, citing reputational risk to ongoing government contracts. The signature at the bottom of the recommendation was Colonel Grant Sheffield's. Rowan read it twice, then a third time, because some part of her kept hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less damning on a fourth pass, and they never did. He knew, she said quietly, to no one in particular, though Preacher, propped up in his hospital bed, pale but alert, was the only one in the room to hear it. He knew the equipment was failing. He knew people were dying because of it, and he chose the cost analysis over the recall. Doesn't mean he wanted your father dead, Preacher said, voice still rough from surgery, but steady. Doesn't mean it isn't exactly the same as if he did. Rowan closed the folder, looked out the hospital window at gray Montana sky, at snow still falling steady over a town that had no idea what was buried beneath its quiet routines. "There's something else," she said. The recommendation memo. It's addressed to somebody. A distribution list. 4 names, all redacted except one. Who? Admiral Marcus Whitfield. Rowan felt the name settle strange in her mouth. A piece falling into a puzzle she hadn't known had this particular shape. He was on the distribution list for this exact memo, which means he knew too. 15 years ago, and he's never said a word. They found Whitfield 3 days later. Not through any deliberate investigation, but through something closer to accident. Vance running background on every name connected to the memo, and finding, buried in a local news archive, a small item about a retired admiral relocating quietly to a lake house outside Fort Larkin, closer to this whole story than any of them had expected. Rowan went alone. She told the others it was safer that way, one person, low profile, easier to walk away clean if the conversation went nowhere. The truth, which she didn't say out loud, was that some part of her needed to look this man in the eyes by herself, without an audience, before she decided what to do with whatever he told her. The lake house sat quiet at the end of a gravel drive, smoke curling thin from a chimney, a boat covered and stored for winter, down by a dock that hadn't seen use in a while. Rowan parked, sat in her truck for a long moment gathering herself, and then walked to the door and knocked before she could talk herself out of it. The man who answered looked older than she expected. Not old in years, Whitfield couldn't have been much past 60, but old in the particular way of someone carrying a weight that had worn grooves into his face over a long, long time. He looked at her for a moment before recognition crossed his features, and when it did, something in his expression cracked open. Grief and guilt, and something that might have been relief all tangled together. "You look like him," he said quietly. "God help me, you look exactly like him." "May I come in?" Rowan said. Not really a question. He stepped back to let her through. The house inside was spare, clean, the home of a man who'd stripped his life down to only what mattered after retirement. A single photograph sat on the mantel, 3 men in desert fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders. One of them unmistakably her father, younger, grinning in a way Rowan barely remembered him grinning in life. "You know why I'm here," she said. Whitfield didn't sit. Stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. the posture of a man bracing for something he'd been bracing for a very long time. "I've known this day was coming for 15 years, he said. "I think some part of me has been waiting for it, almost wanting it, at the end." "Then tell me the truth. All of it. Starting with what you knew, and when you knew it." Whitfield closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had settled in his face. Some decision finally made after 15 years of avoiding it. "I saw the recommendation memo," he said. "Sheffield's memo. I saw it before it went to committee, and I had the authority to override it, to force the full recall instead of the quiet replacement schedule they chose. I didn't. Why not? Because Sheffield told me the recall would kill 3 active contracts and put 1,000 jobs at risk, and because I believed him when he said the failure rate was low enough to manage quietly, and because," his voice cracked, "just slightly, just once, because I trusted him, the way you trust someone you've served beside for 20 years. I let that trust do my thinking for me instead of doing it myself. My father died because of that decision." Yes. Whitfield didn't flinch from the word, said it plain, unadorned, a confession finally given full weight after 15 years of avoiding it. "Your father's team lost commo during an extraction under fire. The relay failed exactly the way the test data predicted it might. He held position to cover his team's withdrawal, because he had no way to call for the support that would have let them withdraw together. He bought them the time with the only thing he had left to give, and he never made it out himself." The room went very quiet. Outside, wind moved across the lake, and somewhere in the house a clock ticked steady, indifferent, counting seconds the same way it had for 15 years while this man carried a truth he'd never spoken out loud. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Rowan said, and her voice, for the first time since she'd walked through the door, wasn't steady at all. "Because I was a coward." Whitfield's eyes were wet now, and he made no effort to hide it. "Because telling you meant ending my career, ending Sheffield's, exposing a contractor with enough money and enough lawyers to make the exposure cost far more than I believed I could survive. Because I told myself silence was protecting the men who served under your father, protecting their pensions, their families, everything built on top of a lie I told myself I could live with." He shook his head slowly. "I couldn't live with it. Not really. I've spent 15 years not living with it. I just never had the courage to do anything except keep failing to live with it quietly." "There's a lawsuit now," Rowan said. "A council vote in 2 weeks. Somebody's paying to have my father's name struck from a memorial wall entirely, to bury the honorable version of his death and replace it with desertion." Whitfield's face went pale, genuinely shocked, in a way that told Rowan, with total certainty, that this particular escalation had not come from him. "That's not," he started, then stopped, some new understanding visibly assembling itself behind his eyes. "That's Ironclad Meridian, moving to protect themselves. If your investigation gets close enough to the recall, close enough to Sheffield's memo, they need your father's credibility destroyed before anyone believes a word connected to him. Discredit the daughter, discredit the father's memory, and the whole thread unravels before it ever reaches back to them. Then help me pull the thread anyway." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. Looked, Rowan realized, like a man finally being offered the chance to do the thing he'd spent 15 years wishing he'd had the courage to do the first time. "I have documents," he said quietly. "Copies I made and never used. I told myself I kept them for accountability, for history, in case anyone ever asked the right questions. I think the truth is I kept them because some part of me always knew this day would come. And some part of me needed to be ready to finally choose differently than I chose 15 years ago. Are you ready now?" Whitfield looked at the photograph on the mantel, at 3 young men, arms around each other's shoulders, before any of them understood what the years ahead would cost. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said, "but I'm done being a coward about it. That's going to have to be enough." The drive back to the cabin felt different than any drive Rowan had taken in the 6 weeks, since Doc first walked into her shop with a folder that changed everything. Because now she had more than suspicion. Now she had a name, a signature, a chain of decisions that led directly from a boardroom cost analysis to a canyon in the dark where her father had run out of time waiting for help that was never going to come. Except knowing the truth wasn't the same as being able to prove it in a way that would hold. Whitfield's documents were copies, unofficial, made by a man technically violating the same classification protections that had kept this buried for 15 years. A good lawyer, and Ashworth was clearly a very good lawyer, would find a dozen ways to argue. Those copies meant nothing in any court, any council, any room where the outcome actually mattered. So the fight wasn't over. It had just changed shape. Back at the cabin, the team gathered around the same kitchen table where all of this had started 6 weeks ago. Doc, Vance, and Preacher, still pale but insisting on being present, propped in a chair with a blanket he kept pretending he didn't need. Rowan laid out everything: Corinne's account, the sealed report with Sheffield's signature, Whitfield's confession, and the copies he'd promised to bring forward when the moment came. "We've got the truth," she said. "What we don't have is a way to make it matter in the 2 weeks before that council vote." "The council vote's not actually the fight anymore," Vance said slowly, working through it out loud. "The council vote's a symptom. The real fight is whoever's funding Ashworth's operation, and that's Ironclad Meridian, protecting a 15-year-old cover-up that just got a lot more dangerous for them because Whitfield's willing to talk." "So we go around the council," Doc said, "straight at Ashworth's funding source." "With what?" Preacher said, voice still rough. "Copies a retired Admiral admits he wasn't authorized to keep? Corinne's memory of paperwork from 15 years ago? That's not nothing, but it's not a hammer either. Ashworth's people will bury it in procedure before it ever gets daylight." Rowan looked at the folder in front of her, at her father's forged discharge papers, at the corporate letterhead that had started this whole unraveling, at a 15-year-old lie that was finally starting to come apart at its careful seams. "Then we need somewhere it can't get buried," she said. "Somewhere public. Somewhere with rules of evidence and a record that doesn't disappear because somebody with money wants it to." "You're talking about a courtroom," Doc said. "I'm talking about forcing this into a courtroom," Rowan said. "If Ashworth's organization is willing to fabricate evidence to strip an honor from a memorial wall, that's fraud. That's actionable. If we bring suit against them, against the Veterans Records Integrity Project, we drag this whole thing into discovery, into subpoena power, into a process. Ashworth can't simply outlawyer his way around with polished sympathy and a nonprofit letterhead. That takes lawyers we don't have," Vance said. "That takes money we definitely don't have." "I have a lawyer," Rowan said quietly. "Somebody Doc found, actually, weeks ago. Attorney out of Fort Larkin, handles veterans' cases pro bono when the case is right. I haven't called him yet, because I didn't have enough to bring him until now." She looked around the table at 3 exhausted, battered people who'd driven hours, broken into secured facilities, bled in the snow, and sat in hospital hallways at 4 in the morning, all for a dead man's honor, and a daughter who'd once told herself she'd built a life specifically so she'd never have to ask this of anyone again. "I think I have enough now," she said. The attorney's name was Marisol Vance, no relation to the younger Vance at the table. A coincidence that made Preacher snort despite his still healing side, the first real laugh anyone had managed in days. She met with Rowan 2 days later in a small office above a hardware store in Fort Larkin. Walls lined with case files, the particular controlled chaos of someone who genuinely cared about every client whose folder sat on her shelves. She listened to the whole story without interrupting once, read through Whitfield's copies with careful, methodical attention, studied the forged discharge papers with the eye of someone who'd seen fabricated documents before and knew exactly what questions to ask about them. "This is good," she said finally, setting the folder down. "This is very good, Miss Calloway. Better than most cases that walk through my door." She looked up, something sharp and focused in her expression now. "I can file suit against the Veterans Records Integrity Project for fraud within the week. That forces discovery. That forces Ashworth's organization to produce funding records, internal communications, everything that connects them back to whoever's actually paying for this. How fast does that move?" "Not fast enough to stop the council vote in 2 weeks, Marisol admitted. "Discovery takes months, sometimes longer. But it starts a clock the other side can't stop. And once that clock starts, they know it. My guess, and I've seen this pattern before, is Ashworth's people try to settle quietly rather than let discovery run its course. They don't want a paper trail leading anywhere near ironclad Meridian's boardroom. And if they don't settle, then it goes to trial, Marisol said. And trial means testimony. Sworn testimony, Miss Calloway, from anyone who has relevant knowledge, including, if it comes to it, an admiral willing to finally tell the truth after 15 years of silence. Rowan sat with that for a long moment. A trial, a courtroom, a public record that couldn't be quietly scrubbed the way 3 news articles about the recall had already been softened and erased. There's someone else, she said slowly. Somebody who might need to testify too. Somebody I haven't told you about yet. Who? Me, Rowan said. My service record's classified, sealed, the same way my father's real record should have been protected and wasn't. If this goes to trial, and Ashworth's people try the same trick they tried at the council meeting, claiming I have no legitimate service history to speak from, I need to know what happens. I need to know if I can actually stand in that room and defend my father's honor without violating 15 years of security clearance. Marisol studied her for a long moment. That's a question for people above my pay grade, she said honestly. But I'll tell you this, Miss Calloway. Sometimes the truth finds its own way into a room, whether the paperwork technically allows it or not. If it comes to that moment, you'll know. People like you generally do. The suit was filed on a Thursday, exactly 9 days before the council was scheduled to reconvene. Word moved fast through Larkspur Hollow, the way it always did. A lawsuit against a nonprofit organization, filed by the daughter of the man whose honor was in question, was not the kind of news a small town lets sit quiet. Ashworth called that same evening. Rowan almost didn't answer. Let it ring twice, 3 times. Some old instinct telling her that picking up meant stepping fully into a fight she couldn't step back out of. Then she answered anyway, because stepping back had never actually been an option. Not really. Not since Doc first walked into her shop with a folder 6 weeks ago. Miss Calloway. Ashworth's voice had lost some of its polish. Not much, but enough that Rowan noticed. This lawsuit is an aggressive move. It's an honest one. You understand this changes the tenor of things considerably. I understand it means you can't keep operating in the dark anymore, Rowan said. I understand it means somebody, somewhere, is going to have to answer questions under oath about who's actually funding the Veterans Records Integrity Project. I understand it means the next room we're both standing in has rules neither of us gets to bend. A long silence on the line. When Ashworth spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. Not defeat, not yet, but a recalculation, the same kind Rowan had watched cross his face in the parking lot 6 weeks ago. You're more dangerous than your file suggested, he said quietly. My file doesn't say anything at all, Rowan said. That's rather the point. She hung up before he could respond, and sat alone in her cabin kitchen in the deepening dark, and felt, for the first time in 6 exhausting weeks, something that might almost have been hope. The hope lasted 4 days. It ended on a Monday afternoon when Marisol called with a voice tight enough that Rowan knew before a single word was spoken that something had gone wrong. We have a problem, Marisol said. A significant one. Tell me. Discovery request I filed yesterday, targeting the Veterans Records Integrity Project's internal communications. It got quashed this morning. Fast. Faster than any judge in this circuit moves on a standard motion, which tells me somebody made a call to somebody. And I don't yet know who or how far up that chain goes. A pause, heavy with something Rowan didn't like the shape of. There's something else. My paralegal, the one who's been running document review on this case since we filed, she didn't show up to work today. Didn't call. Didn't answer her phone. Rowan felt something cold settle low in her stomach. You think she's connected to this? I think, Marisol said carefully, that somebody on my side of this case has been talking to somebody on Ashworth's side. I think that's the only explanation for a discovery motion this specific getting quashed this fast by a judge who had no obvious reason to move that quickly for anyone. Her voice tightened further. I think we have a leak, Miss Calloway, And I think it's someone we trusted. Rowan closed her eyes. Thought of Corinne Ashby's careful blankness in the diner booth. Thought of Whitfield's copies, hidden 15 years, finally offered up in good faith. Thought of every single person who'd trusted her enough to risk something in the last 6 weeks' dock. Driving 8 hours on nothing but instinct. Preacher, bleeding in the snow. Vance, learning the hard cost of moving fast. Whitfield, finally choosing courage after 15 years of failing to find it. And somewhere in the middle of all that trust, apparently, a hole had opened. A door left unguarded. A name she still didn't know, feeding information back to a man in a suit that didn't fit him the way it used to, who reported, in turn, to somebody sitting in a rented office with blacked-out windows, watching all of this unfold exactly as carefully as he'd watched it unfold 15 years ago. "Find out who it is," Rowan said, voice steady, despite everything churning underneath it. "Find out fast. Because if they know about the discovery motion, they know about Whitfield. And if they know about Whitfield," she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Because some things didn't need finishing out loud to be understood by everyone listening. They found the leak 2 days later, and it wasn't Marisol's paralegal at all. She turned up safe if shaken, explaining a family emergency that had kept her phone dead and her attention elsewhere for exactly the wrong 48 hours, an innocent absence that had simply, unluckily, coincided with everything else going wrong at once. The real leak was smaller, quieter, and far closer to home than any of them wanted to believe. It was the courthouse clerk who'd processed the discovery, filing a young man named Dale Petrick, who'd grown up in Larkspur Hollow, who'd known Rowan's name his whole life, the way everyone in a small town knows everyone else's history, and who'd been approached, 3 weeks earlier, by a representative of a veterans support foundation, offering a modest but very welcome payment for simply flagging any filings connected to the Calloway name and forwarding basic details. He hadn't known what he was really part of. That was the part that made it worse. Somehow, not better a decent kid, drowning in student debt, who'd told himself he was just doing paperwork favors for a charity, never once imagining the chain of consequence that ran from his quiet phone calls all the way back to a bullet in Preacher's side, and a discovery motion quashed within hours of filing. He confessed everything to Marisol the moment she confronted him, tears in his eyes, horror dawning slow and complete across his face as he finally understood what he'd actually done. "I didn't know," he kept saying. "I swear to God, I didn't know what it was for." Rowan believed him. That didn't make the damage any less real, because now Ashworth's people knew about Whitfield. Knew, almost certainly, that a retired admiral had documents, had a confession, had finally decided after 15 years to choose differently than he'd chosen the first time, which meant Whitfield was no longer just a witness. He was a target. Rowan drove to the lake house that same night, breaking every speed limit on the empty Montana highway, headlights cutting through dark that felt heavier than usual, heavier with everything that could already have gone wrong in the hours since Dale Petrick's confession. The house sat dark when she arrived. No smoke from the chimney, no lights in any window. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. She was out of the truck before it had fully stopped, moving fast across frozen ground toward a front door standing open. Just slightly, just enough to be wrong. "Whitfield," she called, voice tight, one hand instinctively going to the sidearm she'd started carrying again, without ever quite deciding to. Admiral Whitfield. She found him in the study, slumped in a chair by the window, and for one heart-stopping half-second Rowan's whole world narrowed down to a single terrible assumption. Then he stirred, groaned, lifted a hand to a head wound that had bled down the side of his face and dried dark against pale skin, and Rowan's heart restarted with a lurch of relief so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. 2 men, he managed, voice thick, disoriented. "Came in maybe an hour ago. Took the copies. Took everything. Rowan, every document I had. Are you hurt anywhere else? Can you move? I'm all right." Head's ringing like a church bell, but I'm all right. He gripped her arm, urgency cutting through the disorientation. "Listen to me. They didn't come to kill me. If they wanted me dead, I'd be dead. They came to take the evidence and send a message. That message is that this isn't a threat anymore, Rowan. This is a war, and they've decided to fight it with hands that don't care what they break. Rowan helped him up, guided him toward a chair, checked the wound with hands that had done exactly this 100 times before, in far worse conditions, in far worse places, for men whose names she'd never even known. The copies are gone, she said, but you're not, and you still remember everything that was in them. Whitfield looked at her, something steady settling into his gaze despite the blood and the pain and 15 years of accumulated cowardice finally burning away in the heat of this exact moment. Then I'll say it out loud, he said. Every word of it, in whatever room finally makes them listen. Rowan called Doc, called Marisol, called every person in her small, battered, fiercely loyal circle. And by the time the sun came up gray and cold over the Montana mountains, a plan had already begun to take shape, a plan that no longer depended on stolen documents or careful discovery motions, or a system that could be quietly bent by anyone with enough money and enough patience. A plan that depended, instead, on a courtroom, on sworn testimony, on an admiral finally willing to say out loud what he'd spent 15 years failing to say, and on 3 words that Rowan had been carrying, unspoken, for 6 exhausting weeks, 3 words that would mean nothing to anyone in that room, except the one man who most needed to hear them, the one man whose face, she was already certain, would go the color of old paper the instant she finally said them out loud. Widow 6 actual. The council vote was still 6 days away. The trial, if it came to that, was still further off than any of them wanted. But something in the shape of this fight had changed in the lake house that night, hardened into something with real edges, real stakes. And Rowan Calloway sat in her truck outside Whitfield's dark house at 4 in the morning and understood, with total clarity, that there was no version of this story left where she got to walk away quiet. Her father's name was still on that wall. For now, she intended to make sure it stayed there, whatever it finally cost her to do it. The 6 days between the lake house and the courtroom felt like 6 years compressed into no time at all. That was the strange thing about crisis. It didn't move at a normal pace. It either crawled or it sprinted, and there was no in-between, no ordinary Tuesday where a person got to just breathe. Rowan didn't sleep much in those 6 days. Slept in fragments instead, the way she used to sleep in the field 20 minutes here, 40 there, always half listening for something that might need her fully awake. Because the enemy in this fight didn't wear a uniform, didn't announce itself with a radio call or a silhouette on a ridgeline. It wore a suit that fit too well, and it had already proven, once, in a dark lake house with 2 men and a head wound, that it was willing to move from paperwork into violence when paperwork stopped working fast enough. Marisol filed an emergency motion the morning after the attack. Assault, theft of evidentiary materials, a sworn statement from Whitfield himself, dictated from a hospital bed in Fort Larkin, his voice shaking on the recording in a way that made Rowan's chest ache every time she listened back to it. It worked. Not cleanly, not completely, but it worked enough to force what Marisol called an expedited evidentiary, hearing not quite a full trial, not yet, but a courtroom under oath, with a judge who could no longer be quietly managed the way a small town council session had almost been managed 6 weeks earlier. Judge Admiral Thorne, Fort Larkin County, a man with 30 years on the bench and, as Marisol put it, exactly 0 patience for anybody who thinks a courtroom is a place where money gets to write its own rules. Rowan liked him already, before she'd ever seen his face. She would not like him quite so much in the first 10 minutes of actually meeting him, because reputation and first impression, it turned out, were 2 very different animals, and Judge Thorne's first impression of her informed entirely by paperwork. Nobody had bothered to explain to him, yet was going to be very, very wrong. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear, the kind of Montana sky that looked scrubbed clean overnight. No clouds, no wind, just hard blue stretching over mountains, still wearing their first real snow of the season. Rowan stood in front of the small bathroom mirror in Marisol's office and looked at the woman looking back at her. Dress blues, ribbons she'd earned in places that officially didn't exist, doing things that officially never happened, pinned crooked across her chest because she'd never once, in her life, needed anyone else to help her get them straight. Doc knocked twice on the doorframe. "You ready?" "No," Rowan said honestly. "But I'm going anyway. Same thing, most days." He studied her for a moment, something soft moving behind his tired eyes. "Your father would have worn that uniform exactly the same way. Chin up, not for show, because showing up mattered more than looking comfortable doing it." Rowan's throat tightened. She didn't trust herself to answer that, so she just nodded, once, and followed him out toward the truck, where Preacher waited in the back seat, still pale, still moving carefully, still absolutely refusing to be left behind, despite 3 separate arguments from Doc about whether he was cleared to sit upright for 4 hours straight. Vance sat up front, laptop bag at his feet, ready to feed real-time research to Marisol's table. The moment anything needed verifying on the fly, a family. Rowan thought that, watching them all settle into the truck around her, and the thought startled her slightly, because she hadn't let herself use that word in a long time, not since a folded flag and a door that stopped closing at 3 in the morning, 15 years ago. The courtroom filled fast. Word had moved through 3 counties by now, not just Larkspur Hollow anymore, but Fort Larkin, Grayson Ridge. Every small town within driving distance that had ever had Holt Calloway's name mentioned in connection to its own veterans' roles. Local news vans parked outside. A journalist from a regional paper sat in the second row, notepad already open. Rowan sat at the defense table beside Marisol, hands folded, spine straight. Doc and Preacher sat directly behind her. Vance sat 1 row back, laptop open, quiet and focused in a way that would have surprised the restless, impatient man who'd first shown up on her porch. Whitfield sat in the gallery, 3rd row, a bandage still visible at his hairline, beneath silver hair combed back hard, his navy suit not quite fitting the way it once had. And at the plaintiff's table sat Preston Ashworth, composed as ever, flanked by 2 associates. Rowan didn't recognize, a leather folio open in front of him that she was certain held exactly the same forged documents he'd projected onto a screen in a community hall 6 weeks earlier. Judge Thorne entered at 9 sharp. 60-something, silver hair, a face that had spent 30 years believing paperwork over people, though nobody in that room knew yet how badly that particular habit was about to be tested. "We'll come to order," he said, settling behind the bench, glancing down at a file in front of him that Rowan recognized, with a small internal lurch, as containing the exact same fabricated discharge paperwork that had started this entire fight. "This is an evidentiary hearing regarding allegations of fraud brought by the estate and family of Holt J. Calloway against the Veterans Records Integrity Project. Counsel, you may proceed." Marisol stood, calm, controlled, and began laying out the case exactly the way she'd rehearsed it 3 times the night before Corinne Ashby's testimony, entered by sworn affidavit. The forged signature, the wrong loop in the Y, entered as physical evidence with an expert handwriting analysis attached. The theft and assault at Whitfield's lake house, entered as grounds for the expedited hearing itself. Ashworth, when his turn came, was smoother than smooth, calm, measured. He raised procedural objections that Thorne mostly overruled, but each objection bought him time. Each delay a small tactical victory in a war being fought 1 minute at a time. And then, an hour into the hearing, he did exactly what Rowan had known, had braced for, had spent 6 weeks bracing, for he would eventually do. "Your Honor," Ashworth said, rising, voice pitched with exactly the right measure of reluctant duty. "Before this proceeding goes further, I have to raise a matter of the court's attention. The witness list submitted by opposing counsel includes Miss Rowan Calloway as a character witness regarding her father's service record and reputation. I'd ask the court to review her own service record before granting her that credibility." Marisol stood immediately. "Your Honor, Miss Calloway's service record is not the subject of this hearing. It's directly relevant to her credibility as a witness." "Your Honor," Ashworth pressed on, smooth, unhurried, "because a preliminary records search conducted by my office found no verifiable service record for Rowan Calloway matching the decorations she has. on at least one public occasion, been observed wearing. Thorne's eyes came up from his paperwork, found Rowan directly, and Rowan felt the whole room shift its weight toward her. The particular gravity of 30 strangers and a judge with 30 years of habit deciding, all at once, that the interesting part of this hearing had just begun. Miss Calloway. Thorne's voice cracked through the room like a dropped rifle bolt. Take off those medals. Silence. The kind that has weight. The kind you could lean on. Because nobody moved. Because Doc's hand, behind her, closed briefly around the back of her chair, a small silent gesture of solidarity. Because Preacher, still pale from surgery, sat up straighter despite what it clearly cost him. Because the bailiff by the door shifted his stance, uncertain, and the court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys, frozen midword. Your Honor, Marisol started, half rising. Sit down, counselor. Thorne didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed locked on Rowan. On the ribbons pinned crooked across her chest, the medals that existed nowhere in any database he had access to. The decorations that officially on paper, in every system a judge could query, did not exist. This court does not honor stolen valor. Take them off now. Rowan's pulse didn't spike. That was the strange part. 15 years of training had scraped that reflex out of her a long time ago. What she felt instead was quieter, colder, a kind of falling into place like a bolt sliding home. She looked past the judge, past the flag hanging limp against the wall, past the gallery full of strangers watching a small-town scandal unfold, who had no idea they were about to watch something else entirely. She found the man in the third row, navy blue suit that didn't fit him the way it used to. Admiral Marcus Whitfield, retired, staring at her with an expression that already knew, somehow, exactly what she was about to do. She held his eyes, and she said 3 words, widow, 6 actual. The room didn't understand. The room couldn't understand. To everyone else in that courtroom, those 3 words were nonsense. A code with no lock, 3 syllables that meant nothing. But Whitfield's face went the color of old paper. He stood up, chair scraping. Too loud in a room that had gone dead silent. Bailiff Thorne started, confused now, the authority in his voice cracking at the edges because something had just happened that he did not control and did not understand. Whitfield didn't sit back down. He stood there, one hand braced on the bench in front of him like his knees had gone soft, staring at a woman he'd known since she was 17 years old, sworn to secrecy about a truth he'd carried for 15 years. Your Honor, he said, and his voice came out wrong, thinner than the voice that had once given orders that moved battalions. I need this court to hear something. Before you say another word about that woman's medals. What happened next took most of the morning, and Judge Thorne, to his credit Rowan would think later, once the dust had settled enough to think anything charitable at all, did not simply gavel the room back into procedural order and demand everyone sit down and behave. He recognized, somewhere in the shift of that moment, that something larger than a memorial wall dispute had just walked into his courtroom, and 30 years on the bench had taught him at least this much. Sometimes the job wasn't enforcing the rules you already knew. Sometimes the job was finding out what rules you were actually going to need. Approach, he said, to both counsel tables. And the next 15 minutes happened in hushed voices at the bench, out of the gallery's hearing, while Rowan stood very still at the defense table and felt every eye in the room pressing against her back. When counsel returned to their tables, Thorne addressed the room directly. I'm going to allow limited testimony regarding classified service matters, he said, under seal, with this court's understanding that certain details may need to remain redacted from the public record for reasons of national security. What will not remain sealed is any finding this court makes regarding fraud, forgery, or assault committed in the course of this dispute. Is that understood by both parties? Understood, Your Honor, Marisol said. Ashworth's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Understood. Then let's proceed, Thorne said. Admiral Whitfield, you have the floor. Whitfield walked to the witness stand like a man walking toward something he'd been avoiding his entire adult life, and in a way, Rowan understood. He had been 15 years of avoiding exactly this walk. 15 years finally ending in the space of about 40 feet of courtroom floor. He was sworn in, sat, folded his hands in front of him. The same posture Rowan recognized from a lake house 6 days earlier, a man bracing himself before speaking a truth too heavy to carry any further in silence. Admiral Marisol began, gentle but precise. "Can you tell the court your relationship to Holt Calloway?" I served with him, commanded elements of his unit during several classified operations, across a period of roughly 12 years. Whitfield's voice was steady now, steadier than it had been standing up in the gallery. "I also considered him a friend, one of the closest I've had in my life. And can you tell the court about the circumstances of his death?" Whitfield's eyes flicked briefly toward the gallery, toward Rowan, and something passed between them, permission maybe, or gratitude. Hard to name exactly what. "His death was officially recorded as a training accident," Whitfield said. "That record is false. I know it's false because I was in a position, at the time, to know the truth, and I chose silence instead of honesty for 15 years. A murmur moved through the gallery. Thorne's gavel came down once. Light, more habit than necessity. "What is the truth, Admiral?" Whitfield took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried so long it had become part of his own shape. 16 years ago, a defense contractor, Ironclad Meridian, supplied communications equipment under government contract that had a known defect. Field testing showed the units would fail completely under sustained heat conditions, with no warning signal to alert the user before failure. He paused. "I saw the internal report documenting this defect. I saw the recommendation, prepared and signed by a colleague of mine, Colonel Grant Sheffield, advising against a full public recall in favor of a quiet, gradual replacement program. I had the authority to override that recommendation. I did not. Why not, Admiral? Because Colonel Sheffield told me the recall would jeopardize active contracts and the jobs and pensions tied to them. Because I trusted him. Because I told myself the risk was manageable." His voice cracked, just slightly, just once. It was not manageable. 8 months after that recommendation was signed, Holt Calloway's team lost communications during an extraction under fire. He held position alone to cover his team's withdrawal, because he had no way to call for the support that would have let them withdraw together. He never made it out. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Not a shuffle, not a cough. Just 30 people and a judge, holding still around a truth 15 years in the making. "Why are you telling this court today?" Marisol asked quietly, "when you kept this silence for 15 years? Whitfield looked one more time at Rowan. "Because his daughter walked into a fight. Nobody asked her to fight, to defend a truth she didn't even fully know yet," he said. "And because a man came into my home 6 nights ago, put a gun to documentation I'd finally found the courage to preserve, and took it, and hit me hard enough that I woke up on my study floor, wondering if this was finally the day. Somebody decided silence wasn't enough anymore, that they needed me gone entirely." His hands tightened on the witness stand rail. "I've been a coward for 15 years, Your Honor. I'm done being one. However much that costs me now." Ashworth's cross-examination was sharp, precise. Exactly what Rowan expected from a man who'd spent a career finding the seams in inconvenient truths. "Admiral Whitfield," he began, rising, buttoning his jacket, with the same unhurried composure he'd shown in a parking lot 6 weeks earlier. "You're testifying, under oath, about events 16 years old, based on documents you yourself have admitted were unauthorized copies, now stolen and unrecoverable. Is that a fair characterization?" "It's accurate, yes. So this court has no physical evidence of the report you're describing, only your testimony." "Yes, a testimony," Ashworth pressed, "given by a man who has just admitted, under oath, to 15 years of deliberate silence regarding a matter he now claims involves a soldier's death. 15 years of silence, Admiral, is a very long habit to suddenly break in a Montana courtroom. Why should this court believe you're breaking it now for truth, and not for some other reason entirely?" Whitfield held his gaze steady. "Because I have nothing left to protect by lying, Mr. Ashworth. My career's over. My reputation's already damaged by the 15 years of silence I'm confessing to right now. The only thing left for me to protect is whatever's left of my conscience. And lying today wouldn't protect that. It would finish destroying it. Ashworth's jaw tightened, the smallest crack in 30 years of practiced composure. He tried a different angle. "Let's discuss Colonel Sheffield then," he said. "You've named him as the author of this alleged recommendation. Is Colonel Sheffield here today to answer these allegations himself?" "No, convenient." "Objection," Marisol said. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Thorne said. "Move it along, Mr. Ashworth." Ashworth adjusted, smooth as ever, though Rowan caught something new in his posture, the first genuine strain she'd seen in him since this fight began, 6 weeks and a lifetime ago. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, and sat down. And for the first time since Rowan had met him in a parking lot with rehearsed sympathy in his voice, he looked, for one unguarded moment, like a man who understood he was losing something he'd never expected to lose. Thorne called a recess before lunch, and Rowan walked out into the hallway on legs that felt unsteady in a way 4 hours of holding perfectly still in a courtroom apparently produced far more effectively than any physical operation ever had. Doc found her by a window at the end of the hall, looking out at Fort Larkin's small downtown, gray and quiet under hard winter light. "You didn't have to say it," he said. The 3 words. "You could have waited. Let Marisol build the case around Whitfield alone." "No," Rowan said. "I couldn't have. Because Ashworth was going to use my medals to discredit everything I said from that point forward, which meant I needed Whitfield to understand, immediately, exactly who he was looking at. Which meant I needed to say it before anyone else got the chance to say something worse. You planned that." "I've had 6 weeks to plan it," Rowan admitted. "I just didn't know exactly when I'd need it." Turns out the answer was today. Doc studied her for a long moment. "Your father would have been terrified watching that, and so proud he couldn't have found words for it." Rowan's throat tightened, and she looked back out the window rather than answer, because some things were still too close to the surface to speak about directly, even now, even after everything. The afternoon session began with Ashworth requesting, and receiving, a continuance to properly prepare a response to allegations against a third party not present in this courtroom legal language. For buying Sheffield time, Rowan understood immediately. Time to decide how to answer testimony he almost certainly already knew was coming. Thorne granted 3 days. Not the delay Ashworth clearly wanted, but enough, apparently, to satisfy the letter of due process. 3 days. And somewhere in that window, the Larkspur Hollow Council vote the original 9-day countdown that had started this entire fight was scheduled to happen regardless of what the courtroom decided. 2 clocks running at once, Rowan realized, standing outside the courthouse in the cold afternoon light. One legal, one civic. And no guarantee either one would finish in time to save the other. "The council votes in 4 days, Vance said, checking his phone, voice tight with the specific urgency of somebody watching 2 deadlines collide. "If this hearing doesn't produce a formal finding before then, Dunmore's council votes on whatever record currently exists, which is still, technically, a forged discharge paper and a lawsuit still pending resolution. Then we need Sheffield in that courtroom before 4 days are up," Rowan said. "Not 3 days from now on his own schedule. Sooner. However we manage it. He's not going to walk in voluntarily," Preacher said, leaning heavy against the truck, still pale, still stubbornly present. "Man spent 15 years building silence into an art form. He's not going to break that streak for a subpoena with a due date." "Then we don't wait for the subpoena to work on its own," Rowan said. "We go find him. Today." They found Grant Sheffield exactly where Rowan had feared he'd be, not hiding, not running, but sitting, still and composed, in the rented office 40 miles outside Fort Larkin. The same blacked-out windows, the same manila folder on the desk, the same old service photograph he had, apparently, over 15 years, never once stopped looking at. He didn't seem so surprised when Rowan walked through the door. "I wondered how long it would take you," he said, not looking up right away, his voice older than Rowan remembered from childhood. worn down by something that had clearly been eating at him far longer than these 6 weeks had run. You knew I'd find you eventually. I hoped you wouldn't. He looked up then, and his eyes her father's same gray eyes, or close enough that the resemblance struck her fresh. Every time she thought about it, held something Rowan hadn't expected. Not defiance, not fear exactly, something closer to exhaustion. 15 years of exhaustion, finally reaching the end of what it could carry. But hope was never a strategy. Your father used to say that. I should have remembered it applied to me too. Rowan sat down across from him, uninvited, and let the silence stretch for a moment before she spoke again. Whitfield testified today, she said. Under oath, told the court everything about the recommendation memo, your signature, the recall you chose not to make. Something in Sheffield's face flinched, small, involuntary. I imagined he would. Eventually, he said quietly. Marcus was always the better man between the two of us. He just needed longer than I did to remember that. You sent men to his house, assaulted him, stole his evidence. I sent men to protect something, Sheffield said, and for the first time, something sharp entered his voice, something defensive and tired and old. You think I did any of this for money, Rowan? For myself. I never took $1 from Ironclad Meridian beyond my legitimate consulting fee. And I've given most of that away to veterans' charities I could never publicly connect to my name, because the guilt of it made the money feel like something I couldn't touch clean. Then why? Rowan said, and the word came out sharper than she meant it to. 15 years of grief finally finding a direct target to aim at. Why hide it? Why let my father's death be called an accident? Why let his name almost get stripped off a wall entirely rather than just tell the truth from the start? Sheffield was quiet for a long moment. Because the recall would have grounded 3 active programs, he said finally. Programs that had 1,100 men and women depending on them for their pensions, their benefits, their family security. Because exposing the defect meant exposing the whole procurement chain. And half the officers who'd approved those contracts in good faith would have gone down with it. Their careers, their pensions, everything they'd built. Because I told myself, God help me, I actually told myself that quietly fixing it forward was protecting more people than publicly destroying it backward would save. His hands, folded on the desk, were shaking slightly. I was wrong. I understood I was wrong the moment I heard your father was dead. I have understood it every single day since. But by then the lie was already built, already load-bearing, and I told myself tearing it down would only add more names to the list of people it hurt. So instead you let it keep hurting people quietly, Rowan said. Me, my father's memory, an entire memorial wall's worth of families who trusted that the names on it meant something true. Yes, Sheffield said, and the word cost him something visible, some final piece of the composure he'd spent 15 years constructing around this exact conversation. I did that. I am responsible for that. I don't have a version of this where I come out looking like anything other than a coward who chose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. Over and over, for 15 years, until a granddaughter I never had the courage to properly know walked into a courtroom and made the choice I should have made. A long time ago. Rowan sat with that for a long moment. Anger still burned in her chest, hot and real and entirely earned. But underneath it, something else moved too. Something closer to grief than fury. Grief for a man who'd once taught her father to shoot, who'd stood at his funeral with actual tears on his face, who'd sent birthday cards for 8 years before some private collapse of conscience made even that small gesture too painful to continue. The council votes in 4 days, she said finally. The court needs your testimony before then, or none of this reaches the record in time to save my father's name on that wall. Sheffield looked at the photograph on his desk, at 3 young men, arms around each other's shoulders, before any of them understood what the decades ahead would cost. I'll testify, he said quietly, not because it saves me. Nothing saves me at this point, and I've made a certain peace with that. I'll testify because your father deserved better than 15 years of silence, and because you deserve to stop fighting a war I started. The men who'd assaulted Whitfield were not, it turned out, hired directly by Sheffield et al., a detail that emerged slowly over the following 2 days, pieced together through Marisol's renewed discovery motions, now moving fast under the weight of Sheffield's surprising cooperation, and Vance's relentless digital tracing of payment records that led eventually somewhere Rowan hadn't expected. They led to Ironclad Meridian directly, not to Sheffield's careful, guilt-ridden 15-year silence, but to a corporate security division that had been monitoring the situation independently, escalating on its own authority the moment Whitfield's documents threatened to surface in a courtroom with subpoena power, which meant Sheffield, for all his complicity, all his 15 years of cowardice, had not ordered the attack on Whitfield at all, which meant somebody else, somebody higher, colder, untroubled, doubled by 15 years of guilt, had made that call instead. "There's a name," Vance said. On the second night, laptop glowing in Rowan's kitchen, the same kitchen where all of this had started 6 weeks earlier. Payment authorization for the security contractor who went to Whitfield's lake house. It traces back to an executive account, Regina Holloway, Chief of Corporate Risk Management, Ironclad Meridian. "She's the one who decided violence was an acceptable next step," Rowan said quietly. "Looks that way. Then she's the one who needs to be in that courtroom too." The final 2 days moved faster than any 2 days Rowan could remember, living through Marisol filing emergency motions to compel Holloway's testimony, Sheffield formally cooperating with sworn statements that implicated the corporate chain far beyond his own 15-year-old signature, Whitfield recovering enough to sit through a second round of testimony without the tremor that had marked his first appearance. Regina Holloway, when she finally appeared not voluntarily, but under subpoena, flanked by a legal team considerably more expensive and considerably less composed than Ashworth had managed to remain, was exactly what Rowan expected. Cold, precise. A woman who'd built a career managing risk exactly the way the recommendation memo had described 16 years earlier, quietly, efficiently, with human cost treated as a line item rather than a tragedy. She denied ordering violence directly. Her legal team argued, at length, that the security contractor had exceeded the scope of authorized surveillance, a phrase Rowan found so coldly bureaucratic it almost made her laugh, if laughing had been remotely possible in that moment. But the payment records didn't lie, and Vance's digital trail entered into evidence with a technical precision that even Ashworth's team struggled to challenge, told a story that no amount of careful corporate language could fully soften. Ironclad Meridian had known about the comms relay defect 16 years ago, had chosen concealment over recall, had, when that concealment was finally threatened with exposure, escalated to intimidation and theft rather than accept accountability. And somewhere in the middle of that 16-year chain of decisions, a good man had died in the dark covering his team's retreat, with the only thing he'd had left to give. Judge Thorne delivered his findings on a Friday morning, 4 days after Rowan had first stood up in his courtroom, and said 3 words that changed everything. The courtroom was fuller than it had been all week. Word had spread past 3 counties now. A regional news crew had set up outside, and even Rowan, who'd spent 15 years avoiding public attention as a matter of professional survival, understood there was no putting this particular truth back into the quiet it had been buried in for so long. "This court finds," Thorne said, voice carrying clean and final across a silent room, "that the documentation submitted by the Veterans Records Integrity Project regarding the service record of Holt J. Calloway was knowingly fabricated, constituting fraud upon this court and upon the Veterans Memorial Councils to which it was submitted." He paused, letting the words settle. "This court further finds that credible, sworn testimony establishes that Holt Calloway's death occurred in the line of active duty, under circumstances directly attributable to a known equipment defect that Ironclad Meridian Defense Systems chose to conceal rather than remediate. This court refers the matter of corporate liability and the matter of assault committed against Admiral Marcus Whitfield to the appropriate federal authorities for further investigation." A sound moved through the gallery, not quite applause. Courtrooms didn't allow that, but something close, A collective release of breath held too long. As to Miss Rowan Calloway, Thorne continued, and his eyes found her directly now, something different in his expression than the hard suspicion he'd worn 4 days earlier. This court has reviewed, under seal, sufficient documentation regarding her military service to confirm that her decorations were legitimately earned through service this court is not at liberty to detail publicly, but which this court can confirm on the record were real, were honorable, and were never, at any point, fraudulent. He paused. Miss Calloway, this court owes you an apology for the tenor of proceedings 4 days ago. That apology is now on the record. Rowan felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd been holding rigid for 6 exhausting weeks, and beside her, Marisol's hand found her shoulder, brief and warm and entirely unnecessary to say anything about out loud. The Larkspur Hollow Council voted the following Tuesday, and this time the vote wasn't close. Not because the council had suddenly found courage they'd lacked before. Rowan understood, but because a federal court's findings, entered into public record 4 days earlier, had removed every excuse for uncertainty that had ever existed. Holt Calloway's name stayed on the wall. More than stayed the council, in a gesture Rowan hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure she wanted, voted to add a new plaque beneath his name. A brief inscription, drafted with careful consultation to avoid revealing anything still classified, acknowledging that his death had occurred, protecting his team under circumstances the nation could not yet fully disclose. It wasn't the whole truth. Some of the whole truth would probably never be public, buried under classifications that outlasted courtrooms and council votes alike. But it was more truth than the wall had held in 15 years. And for the first time since a knock on a porch door in July, so long ago now, Rowan felt something close to peace settle where grief and unanswered questions had lived instead. She visited the memorial wall 3 days after the council vote, early morning, before the town had fully woken, frost still silvering the grass around the small park where 40-some names sat carved into gray stone. She found her father's name in the 3rd row, middle of the alphabet, middle of everything, still, the way it had always been, except now there was a new line beneath it. Small, simple, true. She stood there a long time in the cold, hand resting on the stone, and let herself remember him whole, for the first time in years, instead of only in the careful fragments she'd trained herself to hold instead. His hands, guiding hers on a rifle stock, patient in a way he almost never was about anything else. His voice, low, always low. A door closing at 3 in the morning, and now, finally, the truth of where he'd been going, while what he'd been protecting, why the story had never quite lined up right. "I got it back for you," she said quietly. "To the stone, to the cold morning air, to whatever part of a father survived in memory once the man himself was gone. Took longer than it should have, but I got it back, gently, the way she might once have touched his shoulder, had she ever been given enough ordinary mornings to learn how. I'm not angry anymore. I understand why you did it the way you did it. I just wish I'd known sooner that the distance was never really distance at all." Wind moved through the park, soft, the first true spring wind of the season, carrying the smell of thawing earth and new growth, a smell entirely unlike ozone and cold metal, entirely unlike anything from the life she'd spent 15 years half buried inside. She stood there a long while, until the cold finally drove her back toward her truck, and as she walked away, she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not looking over her shoulder at all. The fight was over. The truth was finally whole, and somewhere in the quiet space where 15 years of grief had lived, something new had begun, slowly, carefully, to take its place instead. Peace. Not the absence of loss. Just finally, after everything, the presence of enough truth to make the loss bearable. Rowan Calloway drove back into the mountains as the last light of a long Montana day settled gold across the peaks, and for the first time since a knock on a porch door so many years ago, she let herself believe that whatever came next, she wouldn't have to face it as a ghost anymore. She would face it as her father's daughter, fully, finally, completely, and that, she understood now, had always been more than enough.